everyone. Today we have another new episode, and we will discuss one of the interesting topic. Today's our question is, why do thoughts come from? We have our world famous speaker, Mr. Anthony. Mr. Anthony, what you want to share with our audience? And I know you are a very good scholar, philosopher. So hopefully our audience will get some interesting aspect.
Greetings. Thank you again, Sharif. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to share some of my ideas. Now, thoughts are either part of the material world, patterns of electricity generated by neurons in the brain, or they're part of some kind of cosmic consciousness, the divine, theology, entering into the theological realm. And obviously, this is not detectable by science. Let's start with the material world. Thoughts are physical representations. They have spatial dimensions. The mind is a kind of map. Thus, our thoughts are maps representing and corresponding to things that our brains have either perceived with our senses, felt with our emotions, or formed as an action plan. And of course, all of these are electrochemical processes. So thus, thoughts are basically energy signals. The energy transmitting a thought therefore has mass and shape. So this is a very important point. The energy transmitting a thought therefore has mass and shape. In fact, the ions and molecules encoding the energetic signal have mass as well, which is a very important point. The ions and molecules encoding energetic signal have mass as well. So this is a very, very important concept. So basically, the material world, talking about it from a material perspective, thoughts are physical representations. And since thoughts are physical and have spatial dimensions, it could be possible to read people's thoughts through brainwave pattern and neuronal activity. Now, some thoughts are encoded in memory. Most of our thoughts just pass by and we forget about, but a lot are actually encoded in memory, which is a very important point, which is memory is found within in the region of the brain known as the hippocampus, which is the limbic system. The hippocampus is the area of the brain which actually stores memory. So most thoughts, we just completely forget about, and some are actually consolidated as memories. Now, memory too is a physical process encoded by structural molecular changes in neuronal connections. And I'll repeat that. Memory too is a physical process encoded by structural molecular changes in neuronal connections. And again, this is found within the hippocampus. So it's a fascinating thing. So in short, thoughts are energy signals. Thought is energy signals. And the energy transmitting a thought therefore has mass and shape. And as I mentioned before, the ions and molecules encoding the energetic signal have mass as well. So it's energy, this invisible energy of the brain. In fact, consciousness is invisible energy of the brain. So this is the science. What I've given you here is actually the pure science behind the whole notion of thought process, the actual whole science behind thought process. And as I mentioned, thoughts are maps representing and corresponding to things that our brains have either perceived with our senses, felt with our emotions, or formed as an action plan. And of course, all of these are electrochemical processes. Now, this is the physics, this is the science. Now going into the spiritual dimension, as I mentioned, it's either pertains to the material world, or we have to look at thought process as connected to some higher power, some sort of cosmic consciousness. Now, I've given you the science very quickly, I've broken it down, and now I'm going to go into the theology, into the metaphysics, into the philosophy. What is thought? Well, the best way to summarize thought for me is, for in him we move and live and have our being. Now, I'm talking about God. For in him we move and live and have our being. Science, as I have just explained now, can give us an understanding of what thought process is, as I have explained. These energy signals and so forth, and I've broken it down and explained the whole scientific dimension of thought process. But it can only go so far. Beyond that, then you need something more. Science can only take us so far. Then you need something more. So what I'm saying is, ultimately, although I've given you the science behind thought process, thought process as well as consciousness, because thought process and consciousness are intercombined, has to be connected to God. For in him we move and live and have our being. It's connected to the source. Everything is connected to the source. Our mind, our will, our emotions, our thoughts, our consciousness is connected to the source, the giver of all life. He is the very reason why we exist, why we are, why we can move and live and have our being. So to break it down, as I've said, I've given you the science very quickly, very concisely, very powerful science. But now I'm saying it goes beyond the science. It goes into theological realms. For in him we move and live our being. So ultimately, thought process is interconnected with God, as well as consciousness, as well as our very existence. Now, what is consciousness? Consciousness, from a philosophical dimension, is the continual creation of models. Feedback loops, which describe a model of our place in space and time. Space and time is an electromagnetic field. As I've mentioned many times before, the eye forms an image of the outer world on the retina, which is at the back of the eye, and then transmits the information to the brain. We have this feedback loop process. So consciousness is a quantum process, and the brain actually is made up of quantum fields, as I have mentioned before. But beyond all of that, beyond all of the science and the philosophy, consciousness has to be connected to something even greater, which is God. I've spoken about quantum mechanics and the quantum world in my other presentations, how God works through quantum mechanics and works through the laws of quantum mechanics and subatomic particles, these strings of light that oscillate, that represent and define all of reality. But God is at the end of quantum mechanics. He controls all the mechanisms of life through quantum mechanics, including consciousness and thought process. So if we really want to understand what it means to be human, what is thought process, what is consciousness, we have to go into deep metaphysics. And eventually we arrive to the source, the creator of space and time, God. This is, for me, the greatest way to describe consciousness, because I can give you other examples, as I have mentioned just now. Consciousness is the continual creation of models and so forth. I can give you other illustrations, but if you want to narrow it down, thought process and consciousness has to be interconnected with the source. Otherwise, it becomes impossible, really, to describe consciousness. So thought process, consciousness, our very being is interconnected with the source. God gives life to our world, and consciousness is ultimately connected to a higher power. This is the only way you can truly define consciousness and so forth. Now, a lot of atheists will always bash the idea of God and say, well, how do you know God exists, and so forth, and their atheistic attacks. We know through the glory of the universe, the incredible creation displayed before us, that there must be something beyond space and time, infinite in both space and time. Space and time is an electromagnetic field. Now, atheists always throw this question out. Who created God? Well, this is an oxymoron. This is a non-question. In fact, this is known as circular reasoning. And circular reasoning is the fundamental fallacy in logic. God, by definition, is an eternal being that transcends time and space. By definition, he is eternal. So you can't ask that question. That is a non-question, and it's an oxymoron, and it's known as circular reasoning. And circular reasoning is the fundamental fallacy in logic. God operates through quantum mechanics. God operates through the laws of science, which he himself put into place. And consciousness and thought process and all the mechanisms of life, including our very existence, are connected to the source. This is the true definition of consciousness, thought process, and so forth. Now, some of the I've done this many times with you, Sharif. My first presentation with you was science, philosophy, and theology. I went through a long list of arguments. If you recall, a couple of years ago, I've done many shows which you can watch on YouTube. I'll mention again some of the arguments, even within evolution. Our planet is 4.5 billion years old. Our planet is around 4.5 billion years old. And we go from physics to biology. Then from biology, we have a quantum leap to chemistry, biological processes to chemical processes. Now, no atheist, including Dawkins, including all the top scientists, no scientist actually understands how we had this quantum leap, this sudden transition, this sudden metamorphosis from biological processes to chemical processes. Because as a result of this quantum leap, we had the formation of genetics, the first high-tech genetic molecule, a precursor to DNA and so forth. Now, no scientist knows how this happened. Now, they say that this is just a gap. This is just a gap in our understanding. This is just a small gap in our understanding. This is a black hole for the atheist. Because if you can't explain how genetics started, you can't explain evolution. Because evolution sits on the pillar of genetics. So for us to truly understand evolution, we need to truly understand how genetics started. But they don't. And genetics started as a result of a divine spark. God was working through science, through genetics, and through the laws of evolution, created man. So I say again, very important. We transitioned from physics to biology, from biology to chemistry, this sudden quantum leap, and no scientist knows how this happened. That we started to have chemical processes, biological process to chemical processes, and as a result of these chemical processes, we had the formation of genetics, the first high-tech genetic molecule, a precursor to DNA, and so forth. Okay. And as a result of this, as a result of the formation of genetics, evolution started. But if you can't explain genetics, you can't really explain evolution, because evolution sits on the pillar of genetics. So the likes of Richard Dawkins, Lawrence Krauss, and all these scientists, these atheists, they say this is a gap. This is not a gap. This is a black hole. Because if you can't explain how genetics started, you can't really explain evolution, because evolution sits on the pillar of genetics. Very, very, very important point. Going back to what I said yesterday, and I mentioned this again, very quickly, the whole idea that the universe is eternal. A lot of atheists use this to say, well, the universe is eternal, it's always existed. So if the universe has always existed, we don't need God. We can remove God from the equation because the universe has always existed. Thus, we don't need God. In fact, pantheists, as I mentioned yesterday, pantheists too say this. A lot of pantheists tend to gravitate towards this philosophy that the universe has always existed. As I explained to you yesterday, atheism and pantheism are the same thing. An atheist will say he doesn't believe in God. A pantheist will say he does believe in God. But he doesn't actually believe in God because he's just redefining the concept of God. Pantheists believe that the totality of the universe, including man and everything within the universe, equates to God. But this is not God in the true sense, in the true definition. They're just basically saying that God is part of everything. Well, that's not God. God, by definition, monotheistically speaking, is separate from his creation and created. He's an eternal being that created and set life into motion. So pantheism and atheism are the same thing. In fact, an atheist who's just been honest, he'll just say, I don't believe in God. A pantheist will be deceiving and be very deceiving in the sense by saying, I do believe in God. Well, they don't believe in God. Pantheism and atheism are the same thing. So what they will say is that the universe has always existed. So if the universe has always existed, we don't need God. But we know that the universe has not always existed. We know this from background cosmic radiation, heat remnants left over from the Big Bang. We know that an explosion took place. And we know this through background cosmic radiation. The sheer fact that the universe is expanding as a result of dark energy, 70% of the universe, I repeat, 70% of the universe is made up of dark energy. And the universe is expanding, which indicates that the universe was at some point a cluster, going back to the Big Bang, which took place 13.8 billion years ago, when all matter was condensed into a point, and suddenly exploded into being. And through millions of years of evolution, life came into being. So God was the mechanism behind the Big Bang. So the sheer fact that the universe is expanding tells us that the universe had a point genesis. It was a cluster, and it exploded into being, the Big Bang. And as I've mentioned, the fact that we've detected radiation in the universe, background cosmic radiation implies that an explosion took place. The Big Bang took place, and the universe had a point genesis. Okay, very important. Also, if the universe was eternal, it would have reached a point where it would have used all usable energy. The universe is full of cosmic energy, which tells us that the universe is not eternal, but had a beginning. Not to mention that the second law of thermodynamics takes place within the universe, entropy. Entropy is the law of death. It is the immutable metaphysical law of the universe. Do we see death within the universe? Yes, we do. Take a star. A star succumbs to gravitational collapse as it decays, as it loses energy and decays and becomes either a neutron star or a black hole, singularity and so forth. So there is death within the cosmos, which indicates there was a point genesis, that there was a point genesis to the universe. Now, if you look at the complexity of man, I've spoken about this many times before, that we are made up of many particles, but we're made up, the particle that we are made up of predominantly is a neutron. Now, a neutron is radioactive and it decays within 10 minutes. Okay? Now, this is known as weak decay because within particle physics units, 10 minutes is classified as a long period of time. But within our world, a very short period of time. So we have the relativity of time at play here. So how is it that we exist if we're made up of something that decays within 10 minutes? A neutron. Incidentally, when a neutron decays, it decays into 3 separate particles because of the first law of thermodynamics. You can't destroy energy, the conservation of energy. So when a particle when the neutron decays, it decays into 3 separate particles because of the first law of thermodynamics. It becomes a proton, electron, and neutrino. So how is it that we exist? How is it that we exist if we are made up of predominantly neutrons? Once you place a neutron into a nucleus, it becomes bound, which means it requires energy to release itself from. As it becomes bound, it loses energy. If we apply the theory of relativity from Einstein, which is E equals mc squared, so it becomes bound in the nucleus. As it becomes bound, it loses energy. Once we apply E equals mc squared, if it loses energy, it will also lose mass. It loses so much mass that it stabilizes within the nucleus and it doesn't decay. And this is the reason why we exist. So once you place a neutron into a nucleus, it becomes bound, loses energy. E equals mc squared, so it loses energy. It will also lose mass. It loses so much mass that within the nucleus, within the atomic nuclei, it stabilizes. And this is the reason why we exist. This is a complex process within nuclear physics. In fact, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, all the heavy elements exist because of this process. An atheist will just say that this is basically, fundamentally speaking, it just happened. It's a miracle. This is impossible. There has to be a mechanism behind this process. What is at play? What is working behind the processes of nuclear physics? There has to be a mechanism. Otherwise, this is impossible. This is order out of chaos. Essentially speaking, this is order out of chaos. Through chaos, God establishes order. Through this complex process within nuclear physics. An atheist would just say, well, this is just some random, incredible natural occurrence. It's impossible. This requires thought process. There is a mechanism at work within nuclear physics. Order out of chaos. Through chaos, God establishes order. As I've mentioned before, with the atom that lacks an electron creates life. The atom that lacks an electron creates life. The stable atom, as we perceive it, doesn't do anything. It's the atom that lacks an electron that seeks to merge with other atoms in order to make up for the missing electron. And through this, we have covalent bonds. So the atom that lacks an electron binds to other atoms in order to gain atomic equilibrium. And as a result, it binds to other atoms. And as a result of binding to other atoms, as a result of this abnormality, molecules are formed, RNA, DNA, and the whole process of life begins as a result of an imperfection at an atomic level. Order out of chaos. And this proves that the whole notion of perfection is nothing but a construct of the mind, because the atom that is considered to be stable doesn't do anything. It's the abnormal atom. It's the atom that is looking to merge with other atoms to make up for this abnormality due to the fact that it lacks an electron. And through binding to other atoms, molecules, RNA, DNA are produced, and the whole life cycle starts as a result of an atomic deficiency. So this proves without doubt that the whole notion of perfection is nothing but a construct of the mind. And the more we look into even the whole situation like yesterday, the whole notion of ethics and morality, where do we get this understanding of right and wrong? Where do we get this understanding of right and wrong? The sheer fact that we have this intrinsic understanding of what is right and wrong tells you, this is the anthropological argument, that there must be a God. The sheer fact that by design we have an understanding of right and wrong clearly reveals that there must be a greater power. He designed us that way as he built us in his image. This is known as the anthropological argument. Of course, atheists will say that through biological evolution, through the whole process of biological evolution, man developed this whole sense of understanding of what is right and wrong. Through the process of biological evolution, man evolved and develop this understanding of what is right and wrong. For me, the anthropological argument stands. It is God that inscribed within the very fabric of our being this understanding of what is right and wrong. This is the reason why we are morally sensitive. Now, I do agree that morality must be grounded in logic, because the complexity of life is such that we are faced with all sorts of moral decisions daily. And ultimately speaking, hi, Donald. Ultimately speaking,
sorry I'm late.
No problem. Ultimately speaking, for me, morality needs to be grounded, as I mentioned yesterday, in logic. No question about that, because of situation ethics, moral relativism. It's not always easy to make the right moral decision. So one has to look at morality in a relative sense, no question about it, due to the complexity of life. So logic does come into the whole notion of morality. If you want to look at morality, you have to look at it also from a logical perspective. So logic has to come into the whole notion of morality. But as beyond all of that, as I mentioned yesterday, from the anthropological argument, it has to be interconnected to the source, this eternal being that transcends time and space. I'll give it to Donald. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Donald. What do
Well, I'd like to, since there's only the two of us, I'd like to ask Anthony a question. When you're talking about logic, what do you mean?
For me, rational thought. The whole notion, I know where psychologically you're angling this. The whole notion of rational thought. We exist. How do we exist? Why do we exist? For me, and I say this with the politest of ways, obviously, Donald. For me, atheism equates to no purpose of life. Not only does it equate to no purpose of life, it equates to no purpose of morality and ethics. If we believe that we are nothing, because atheism essentially is this, that we evolve, I believe in evolution as well. I'm a theistic evolutionist. So I believe in evolution as well. I'm a theistic evolutionist. Okay, so I just mentioned that. I'm all for evolution. I'm not anti-evolution. So I'm not diametrically opposed in that sense from you. But for me, atheism is all about just basically, as Dawkins said, a natural miracle occurs in science, which tells me that Dawkins does believe in miracles. He actually attacks theists about miracles, but he believes in miracles himself, because he says all the time, a natural miracle occurred in science, a natural miracle occurred in genetics for evolution to take place. So he does believe in miracles in a scientific sense. So he's actually contradicting himself there. So for me, rational thought is looking at the universe, looking at what we are metaphysically, a triune being made up of body, soul, and spirit. The spirit pertains to the very essence of who we are. The soul is a nexus of electromagnetic forces. It's our mind, will, and emotions, interconnected with consciousness, which is the continual creation of models, feedback loops, which describe a model of our place in space and time. And the carnal part is the biological dimension. So in a sense, we're a triune being, in a sense, going back to what I said about the universe, that the universe can be looked at as a trinity. It's a space-time matter continuum. Space, time, and matter. Space is three-dimensional. Within each dimension, it permeates all of space. A time, past, present, and potential future, because the future can only exist as a potential. And matter, light and sound. Matter, light, and sound is the unseen, omnipresent energy that manifests itself in various forms of measurable motion corresponding with natural phenomena. Light produces light waves that produces the light that is seen, and the same mathematics for sound. Interestingly, this does prove, without any doubt, within Christian theology, that you can actually have three in one. I'm not a Christian, I'm a theistic evolutionist, but within Christian theology, they talk about the whole notion of having three in one, three persons, but yet one God, three personalities, yet God is one in essence. So it can actually work cosmologically. There's no doubt about that. But I'm not a Christian, I'm a theistic evolutionist. So I just thought I'd mention that. So for me, the whole notion of believing that literally we just evolved and that basically at death there's nothing, for me is irrational. But anyway, I'm going to let you speak now.
Well, I mean,
thank you.
I find that really interesting, because I don't think you answered my question, but and I'd still like to explore that, because.
Well, for me, I mean, you've seen my presentations. I sent you my presentations, and I know you.
Yeah, I looked at your videos. I've definitely looked at your videos.
For me, logic is what I did there, breaking it down, analyzing things, looking at the science, looking at what we are, investigating, exploring all these dimensions. For me, that is logic. That is a logical process, a logical deduction. Asking the question, who are we? What are we? Does it make sense to believe that there is nothing after death? We are energy. You can't destroy energy. So looking at things, investigating things, probing, searching, looking at the science, looking at the philosophy, looking at theology, pure theology, not religion, pure theology. So this is a gradual step. This is a logical breakdown. So within all my lectures, you want me to define logic, my lectures are logic, based on logic. I give arguments, rational thoughts. You may not believe them, but I present the arguments in such a way that one can go away and say, I will digest that, I agree, or in your case, as an atheist, or maybe as an anti-theist, you'll say, no, I reject it. But that is what I have done. My lectures, my presentations, my books are the illustration of logic. I take science, I take philosophy, and I use philosophical argumentation to back my ideas. Logical deduction, rational thought, that is my description. Anyway, I'll let you say your piece because I don't want to.
Okay. Well, I do want to point out that that the idea of breaking things down and the question of kinds, natural kinds, is a fairly complex issue in philosophy. And
can I ask you a question? Let me just ask you a question. Okay.
Yeah.
I've given you my answer. You asked me something. I gave you my answer in terms of how I break things down in a logical structure. In terms of my argumentation. Well, you may disagree, but I'm giving you my answer. So
I don't feel that you answered it, but that's fine.
That's fine.
Okay, Mr. Anthony, give Mr. Donald time.
I wanted to ask you one question.
No, later. Just give Mr. Donald time to finish his argument or analysis, Mr. Donald.
Okay. I think it's interesting because eventually we can talking philosophically, there's a question of like when you break things down in the world, like what are the things that are in the world, and the things that are in the world everything is ultimately identified by our culture or like everything is really socially constructed. So what it is, it's physically there, but what it is based on our culture, like the Coke bottle scene in The Gods Must Be Crazy, which is, have you ever seen The Gods Must Be Crazy?
No, I haven't actually seen that.
Oh, you should see it. It's a fabulous movie, and there's a scene in it where a bush pilot throws a Coke bottle into the Kalahari, and it falls into the camp of the Kalahari, or in front of a member of the Kalahari Bushmen, and it's been set up that the Kalahari Bushmen are completely detached from the Western world, and they live in this bucolic, peaceful place where they're completely connected to nature, and they live this completely peaceful life. And they see this Coke bottle, and they have absolutely no idea what it is. So they use it to as a hammer, as a musical instrument, to stretch snake skins, all kinds of things. And it's quite amusing because of course we know what we know what a Coke bottle means. We know what it is, but it kind of points out the point that the meaning that it has is because we learned the meaning from the social environment that we're in, and they gave it completely different meaning because they didn't have that background, and everything's like that. So I find that when we try to like break things into things and create ontologies, like try to try and understand what there is in the world, it's a little fraught with peril because two different people especially two different cultures can break things down into different ways.
Absolutely.
And I do want to say that I don't say that there is no God. because, that's something I don't appreciate. I mean, I think that's almost like a religious statement too. I mean, that's not, I think Dawkins and Hitchings and things like that are the new atheists.
Yeah.
The new atheist people are kind of, all I say is that I've never seen any evidence of it whatsoever. And I would like to ask somebody, like, what experiment would you design to show me, not reasoning, because I, we don't have time to it. But what I was trying to get you to talk about is what logic is itself. And you were kind of vague about deduction, but deductive logic is just tautologies, and it's not. It doesn't really tell you anything. So, and inductive logic is just like we see patterns, and then abductive logic is that we make guesses. And so all of the different, there's three types of logic. And if somebody wants to do something and say, look, I'm being logical, to me, it's important that we step back and we say, here is the logic I'm using, and this is how this fits and works within logic.
All I would say, and I appreciate you saying that, all I would say is, for me, obviously being a theistic evolutionist, and all I try to do with my arguments, as you've seen, I sent you two of my presentations, my very first one with Sharif and the other one with the other Indian gentleman. I just try and back up my arguments using science, reason, logic, theology, philosophy, metaphysics, and so forth, and present my argument. Now, I know a lot of atheists struggle with the whole notion of God because of suffering. Now, I know that because I have a lot of friends that are atheists, and they see my presentations and so forth, and my arguments, philosophical arguments, scientific arguments, and so forth, but they come back to me and they struggle with the whole notion of suffering. There is so much suffering and evil in the world. How could there be a God? So I know that suffering is one of those issues that a lot of atheists bring up, because it's just the world is. If you look at some of the things that are happening, is a cesspit. But what I say is, the evil that takes place in the world doesn't disprove God's existence. Even if you have to come, and I'm saying this hypothetically, even if you came to the conclusion that well, if God exists, He's evil. Well, so be it. But as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't disprove this mechanism. For me, God exists, period. Whether He's good or evil, or dualism, good and bad. So God's being, what his personality, we have to separate that from the notion of His existence. God exists, as far as I'm concerned, via looking at the laws of quantum mechanics and philosophy and the nature of man, metaphysics, and so forth. God exists without a doubt. Now, whether He's good or bad is another thing. That's a separate issue. Or dualism, like the Zoroastrianism, the dualism that God could be good and bad. This is a separate issue. That God exists and He created life, as far as I'm concerned, absolutely. Whether He's good or bad, or whether He's pure good or pure evil, is another subject altogether. But it doesn't disprove this mechanism. That's what I'm saying. And not to mention that evil, as far as I'm concerned, evil only exists within the soul of man. Hear me out. Evil only exists within the soul of man as an acting potential within the reptilian complex. There's that, very well, that region of the brain known as the reptilian complex. Within that region of the brain, if you get an abnormality within that region of the brain, the reptilian complex, an abnormal amount of electrical and chemical activity taking place within that region of the brain, so basically an abnormality within the reptilian complex, it brings out the worst in man. So evil only exists within the soul of man as an acting potential. In other words, it's an abnormality within the reptilian complex. Too much electrical and chemical activity brings out the worst in man, and then men go and do evil acts. Men go out and do evil acts. But outside of man, there is no such thing as evil. An earthquake.
I understand that. I get the impression that God currently is not actively involved in like he was sort of a prime mover. He created the laws and so on like that, but he's not actively involved. Right?
Yeah, this is deism. He set life into motion and sits back, basically. Yeah, deism. That He created life through the laws of physics, through the laws of evolution, he set life into motion, but he doesn't intervene with natural human phenomena. He sits back and lets things unfold due to the laws that he implemented himself.
That's your view, basically?
That's deism. Yes, deism.
Okay, that's your view.
Deistic evolution, deism. Yes.
Well, that's, you know, in the end, it seems to me that it sort of almost doesn't make a difference because like, it seems to me that the question is like what, like the Big Bang happened, and the question is, what is it that's the initial source of the Big Bang? And so there's like basically folded down into two answers. One is that somehow there was matter or energy, and we don't really know how. And then the other one is to say, well, there's some force outside of time and space that created it. Those are the two questions. And so I just personally say, why add the complexity of having some sort of being that did it? And the reason that I say that is because I'm run into the situation a lot where it's very easy to say, well, if you logically, this is how things happen. I'll give an example. I have a friend who has studied hierarchies in animals, and he's the world's leading person who does this. And he was a sociologist who had the same mentor as me, Harrison White. And his name's Ivan Chase. He's a wonderful person. And he proved 100% that hierarchies in animals do not form by pairwise dominance. And so basically the logical thing about how hierarchies form is that the biggest, baddest one beats up the second biggest, baddest one, and the second biggest, baddest one beats up the next biggest, baddest one, and the hierarchies kind of form with this, you know, merit of some sort. And he proved that that is not how hierarchies form, not in any animal. So that's an example of where we come up with a logical explanation, but if we actually study it very, very carefully, our logical explanation isn't correct. Oftentimes there's books, what's that guy who wrote, Guns, Germs, and Steel? His name will come back to me, but that book is just an example of somebody who just logically decided the way that history unfolded and anthropology unfolded, and it's horseshit. I mean, he has absolutely no basis for anything that he said, but it's just so wonderful and compelling and logical of a story that people read it and went around going, oh yeah, this is great. So all I'm saying is that I've just run into so many cases where people have very compellingly and logically worked out explanations for things that are wrong. The explanations turn out to be wrong. So as a scientist, my interest is saying, well, how can we check and see if our explanations are actually correct? So with the God hypothesis, I ask myself the question is, how could we check to, not just logically, because logically it's very, very easy to come up with wonderful explanations that turn out not to be correct. But how could I check it in some sort of a way so I'd be, that I could check it? And in this particular case, I don't see any way to actually check it because, and so I ask myself, Occam's razor, what is the simplest explanation? And to me, not having a God is a simpler explanation. And to you, it seems that having a God is a simpler explanation. And so
it seems to me that you're more of an agnostic, though, because you said you're not sure. So you're actually an agnostic. You're not really an atheist. You're an agnostic.
Actually, agnostic is a larger, more general term. But what they sometimes say is agnostic atheist. because agnostic is more general. It has to do with your belief and knowledge in general.
Atheism, yeah?
Yeah, they say agnostic atheist, yeah.
/ atheist, okay. So you're more gravitating towards the atheistic end of that, okay.
Right, well, yeah. It's agnostic has a broader belief about knowledge in general, and so
one who doesn't know. You sit on the fence. You don't.
I'm an agnostic who says, well, it's, I don't believe there's God because I don't see any reason to believe that there's God. So I don't say there is no God. I just simply say I don't believe there is one because there's no reason for it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, as I said before, I mean, obviously through the Hadron Collider, we've discovered the Higgs field. There's an invisible field everywhere in the universe, and this invisible field defines all of reality. This invisible field defines all
I know.
We live in a giant cosmic superconductor. And as I said before, Dawkins and Krauss have said many times, if you wait long enough, you're guaranteed by the laws of quantum mechanics to produce something out of seemingly nothing because of this invisible field. Because gravity allows for positive and negative energy configurations. So you can produce something out of seemingly nothing. In fact, there's no such thing as nothing, because even nothing is something, as you know. In fact, nothing is a physical concept because it's the absence of something, and something is a physical concept. So basically, out of nothing, you can produce something, which is particles and matter, and then a universe full of stuff, because gravity allows for positive and negative energy configurations.
If you could look at the book,
create physical realities. This is my argument. Physical laws cannot create physical realities. But anyway,
if you could look at the books that are behind me, you would see that there's quite a few that are books like quantum mechanics for the gifted amateur, the mathematics, basic mathematics of quantum mechanics, and things like that. So I've spent a lot of time, learning about tensors, and all the kinds of things that you need to know to be able, Lie groups, and all the various kinds of things you need.
The quantum world is so complex that even the best of scientists are still grappling hard to truly understand it. I mean, it's incredibly, as you know, incredibly complex and mysterious that we're still battling to understand it. All I'm saying is for myself that the deeper you go into quantum mechanics and the complexity and the mathematics that takes place within this quantum world, for me, there has to be an ultimate mechanism that controls all the mechanisms of life, all the mathematics that is involved within the quantum world. And this, for me personally, is this eternal being that transcends time and space. He is the mechanism behind all the processes of quantum mechanics, physics, nuclear physics, atomic physics, and so forth. And he is the one, I mean, as you know, the universe operates on mathematics. The laws of nature operate on mathematics. For me, he is the being, the transcendent being that implemented all those laws into nature for the world and the universe to operate as it does. This is just me as a theistic evolutionist. But I respect your position, Donald, and thank you for sharing.
Yeah. I do want to say mathematics isn't one thing. I mean, there's the kinds of mathematics you have to learn quantum physics are a lot different than the kind of. I mean, there's you can generate algebra. I mean, it's like there's not algebra. There's algebras, and there's the. You can basically create math.
The more complex the system, the greater the need for a greater mechanism. For me, the more complex the system, the more complex the mathematics, the greater the complexity of mathematics and so forth, and the nature of the quantum world, the greater need for a mechanism. The more complex, the greater need for a mechanism, because it blows the human mind. There's only so much that us as human beings can understand. Even Werner Heisenberg himself said the more he learned, he realized ultimately he knew nothing. Werner Heisenberg himself, the more he went into quantum physics, he came to the conclusion that we ultimately know nothing, because the human brain can only reach a certain point of understanding, and then it transcends the brain. It transcends the mechanisms of the mind, consciousness, and it goes into that metaphysical, theological dimension where God controls all the mechanisms of life, And this is something that we can't understand because God transcends time and space and dwells within eternality. This is my position. But anyway, you do realize that we're here to talk about thoughts.
Yes, let's get back to thoughts. I was just hoping we could get there.
But anyway, it's been great. It's been great to share. Thank you.
So where do these thoughts that you have come from?
I'm sorry?
Where did the thoughts that you have come from?
Well, I've just been discussing that. I can go over that again.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways of looking at it. There's the spiritual dimension, that consciousness and thought processes is interconnected to this source, the eternal source that transcends time and space. So the only way you can ultimately describe thought process, consciousness, and the very mechanisms of our existence is to be interconnected with theology. For in him we move and live out. For in him we live and move and have our being, as I've just told you the last 20 minutes. The other way is that thoughts are physical representations. They have spatial dimensions, yeah? They have spatial dimensions. Thus, our thoughts are representing and corresponding to things that our brains have either perceived with our senses, felt with our emotions, or formed as an action plan. So all these are electrochemical processes. So in short, thoughts are energy signals. The energy transmitting a thought, therefore, has mass and shape. And so we can talk about ions and molecules encoding energetic signal that has mass too. So basically, we're talking about its energy. Fundamentally speaking, thoughts are energy. Okay. Now you can have your.
Well,
By the way, since thoughts are physical and have spatial dimensions, it could be possible to read people's thoughts as a result of this, hypothetically speaking, through brainwave patterns and neuronal activity. But this is another subject. Anyway, I'll let you continue.
Well,
you can have your explanation.
You have to have a little bit of background about how your brain works. And I've talked about it before about the interoceptive networks. And the interoceptive networks are not like a single network. You kind of break them down into multiple networks. One of the most important networks in your brain are what are called the default mode networks. And the default mode network works all the time. It's a part of your brain that's consistently active. Yeah. And got to go back to something that I've mentioned in a lot of shows before, is that we don't get sensory data and then act on that sense data directly. So when I took psychobiology back in the 70s, we learned about how a visual representation worked in our brain. So similar to the way a camera works, the light comes in through your eyes, it goes to your retina. Your retina is basically a whole bunch of little tiny points. Those little tiny points go into the nerves come back and they get into your brain, and then there's levels of processing. So basically your brain starts recognizing shapes, just actually very similar to the way deep learning systems work. It starts recognizing these shapes through these neural things, and eventually it comes to a representation that then starts getting integrated with the rest of the parts of your brain and allows you to be able to act on it. But the kicker is that we missed a piece. And the piece is that what's happening is that these default mode networks are creating the representation that you have in the world. In other words, all of the things around you, when you look at things and you feel things and you smell things, and all those kinds of things, all of that, it's not because you're smelling because of that information. It's not because of the light that's coming through and working on your brain. It's because your brain creates a representation of the world around you. And you're acting on that representation. And when that representation doesn't match what happened, what the input when it doesn't match the input, then it changes the representation so that the representation is more accurate. And some of the consequences of that are all things like it explains a lot about optical illusions and why we miss things and all kinds of stuff, because we're not if the model basically isn't updated, then we just miss things. It's just not there. We're not really, and that's important, because the reason that that's important when you're getting to the idea of thoughts is that what's happening is your brain is generating reality on an ongoing basis for you. And so
it's essentially a quantum process.
Everything is a quantum process, and of course it's going to be then ultimately it's going to be at the next layer up. It's a biological process.
Absolutely.
And at the next layer up, it's going to be a
brain consists
psychological process, and then a social process, and there's all these layers. But the point that I'm trying to make is that if you just examine yourself, when I'm talking right now, am I at any point actually thinking of what I'm going to say? Not exactly.
I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you said that, because I was just about to mention that.
Yeah.
That we're speaking, where are these thoughts coming from? So you, in a sense, you're embracing what I'm saying. You can explain thought process to a certain extent, like I have done, in terms of the brain, but then it goes beyond that. Where are these thoughts coming from? We're just sitting here, and words are coming into our minds.
Well, I'm pretty sure that they come from. I'm pretty sure that they come from the default mode network.
But
I'm pretty sure that what happens is you're constantly generating things that you could say, and you're constantly doing it, and that your brain selects from the different possibilities that are being generated all the time. And I mean, a really good example, a really interesting and good example, or interesting thing about it is if you look at what's called positive psychology. And positive psychology kind of has an interesting kind of thesis behind it. And I want to say that it is empirically gotten to be the most successful type of psychology to help people change. So there's some of the kinds of cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the things that came out of it, and cognitive behavioral therapy is the most kind of effective therapy for so many things. Like it helps you sleep, it helps you quit smoking, whatever, helps you get. It's really good for depression, for all of these different things. And what cognitive behavioral therapy does is it trains you to change your thoughts. So oftentimes when people are feeling depressed or other kinds of things, they have thoughts that are things like, I feel I'm not a good person. People don't like me. I'm not going to be able to succeed at this. I know I failed. Last time I took a math test, I did terrible on it. I don't even know why I bothered to study, because I'm just no good at math, and I won't be able to succeed. I don't know why I asked her out, because all women reject me when I ask them out. You get these thoughts, and think about how that would work with the idea that you're really generating your reality. Lo and behold, you're creating your own reality, which is the way your brain works. As I said, you're not acting on the actual the things around you. You're acting on this model that your brain is generating. And so what winds up happening in cognitive behavioral therapy is that get the person to identify those negative thoughts, and you say to them, you say, have you ever done well on a test? And yeah, I used to test once. And say, so it's not true that you can't ever do well on tests. So then you start saying, well, what's a positive thing that you could say? I've done well on tests before, and I can do well on tests. And if you just do that for a while, it retrains those models in your brain, and it retrains your brain, and it actually is extremely effective at getting people to be able to change how they interact with the world. It changes how they interact with the world, and it's very, very, very well studied. It's extremely. I mean, if you just talk to any psychologist, it's the key to modern not psychotherapy exactly, but it's the basis now for all psychological change management.
Sharif.
And so pointing that out about thoughts is really interesting. I'd recommend to anybody that is listening here, you can do that.
I mean, we discussed before, the brain is so fascinating. As I said, we said it's one of the most complex things in the universe. The complexity of that takes place within the brain, within the synapse and the synaptic activity and neural adrenaline and serotonin, dopamine, and so forth. All the biochemical interactions within the brain. I mean, it's a universe in itself, in quotes, And as you know yourself, the brain consists of quantum fields. Everything consists of quantum fields, and the brain consists of quantum fields. So it's a universe in quotes in itself, and it's fascinating. It really is fascinating.
Thank you. I have to go for the concluding remarks. I request Professor Donald, what's your concluding remarks for today's session?
Well, I'm kind of finishing. I'll finish a little bit of what I'm saying is that your brain is active. It's always, even when you're asleep. That's why you have dreams. Like I have this Fitbit, and it keeps track of my heart rate and things during my sleep. And sometimes during my sleep, my heart rate goes up quite a bit. And I asked my sleep doctor about that. I said, and he said, well, your brain is working during the sleep. That's just a normal thing. Your brain is doing stuff. Your brain is working all the time. And so what is one of the things you do most in life is you communicate and interact with other people. And so since your brain is basically creating your reality for you on an ongoing basis, thoughts are experiments in a way about what your reality, they're experiments. So how often do you think, when you're thinking, are you thinking about what you're going to say to somebody, descriptions of things around you, like descriptions of yourself, descriptions of things that just basically, and those are really kind of hypotheses. They're like guesses about things around you. And your brain, I talked to a neuroscientist at Stanford, and was asking him the question, how much of your brain is dedicated to consciousness? And he said, probably 2-3%. Nobody really knows. Nobody has a big number. But the point of the matter is you almost have to ask, like, what are thoughts? I mean, that our brain is constantly doing that. And so what winds up happening when I go back to that speech thing is that your brain has been practicing what you're going to say. And so when you get to a point, like right now, my brain has, in a way, practiced it, because I've thought it, I knew what we were going to talk about. My brain has been all night, or ever since I knew the topic, my brain has been practicing, but I don't even know it's doing it. But if I turn my brain towards the topic, then I start having thoughts, and it's basically practicing. And so and the thing that I want to kind of conclude with is I want to say that you do have some influence over the kind of thoughts you have, and you kind of have to do it in a mechanical way. So that thing that I was saying about identifying negative thoughts, finding a counter to the negative thought. So, is there ever been a time when what you're thinking, the negative thing, isn't true? And then just creating a positive thought instead. I can do well on exams. I have done well on exams. I can do well on exams. I have had a good experience talking to women or men, whatever, like that. And just reforming your thoughts can change your whole life and change your whole world. And so I want to encourage people to realize that you're not completely controlled by your thoughts, and they're things that they're your brain, like experimenting, like guessing and practicing the world around it. So you can have your brain practice different things. I want to say one other little thing. There's layers. Anthony points this out a lot, and the part of your brain that like has self-control is in the frontal lobes, like the anterior cingulate cortex. And the part of your brain that's more reactive to emotional things is the amygdala and the hypothalamus. And what happens is if one is active, it can overwhelm the other. So if your amygdala is really active, it kind of shuts down your anterior cingulate cortex. And so you start having thoughts that are based on memories that are from highly emotional things, usually fear. So the thoughts that you're going to have are going to be thoughts that are related to that kind of thing. And if you can switch and start having the part of your brain that's for the executive control, the anterior cingulate cortex, it calms down the other part of the brain. And so one thing I do is do things like count backwards from 100 by 3. Just do some sort of thing in your brain that basically forces you to use your anterior cingulate cortex and overwhelms the other part. And believe it or not, just doing something like that will calm down your negative thoughts and start allowing you to have some sort of self-control again. So thoughts, we know quite a bit about where thoughts come from and how you can change them. And it's a kind of a beautiful thing. So
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Can I get my last bit in, Sharif?
Yes.
Just my last conclusion. Again, going back, just to summarize it. Again, thoughts are energy signals. So thoughts are energy signals. The energy transmitting a thought, therefore, has mass and shape. And going back to what I mentioned before, the ions and molecules encoding the energetic signal have mass as well. So this is very interesting. And as I mentioned before, since thoughts are physical and have spatial dimensions, could it be possible to read people's minds through looking at certain brainwave patterns and neuronal activity? Now, I'll also mention this. Memory, too, is a physical process encoded by structural molecular changes within these neuronal connections. And this is part of the hippocampus, the limbic system. And I'll end with this, and Donald will know this himself, with algebraic topology. Through algebraic topology, in the new mathematics, we've been able to scan the brain as a whole in ways like never before, including neural networks and individual neurons themselves. So algebraic topology has been a huge breakthrough within science for actually scanning the brain and understanding these neural networks in a more complex way, and individual neurons as well. But for me, again, I will end with this. For me, we can talk about science for the next 3-4 hours, and it's fantastic, brilliant. But for me, ultimately, beyond all of the science, beyond all this complex science that we have spoken about today, and all the mechanisms of the brain and so forth, and synapses and the brain structure and so forth, and all the mathematics that takes place within the brain at a quantum level, which is fantastic and fascinating. Beyond all of that, it has to be connected to the eternal source that transcends time and space. This is a divine being that exists eternally, God. So it ultimately has to be connected to theology. All that science ultimately has to be connected to theology. And I'll close there. Thank you, Sharif, and thank you, Donald.
Thank you for joining today's session. Thank you all of our speakers, those who joined today's session, and I request all of our audience, please share our content. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye, and take care.
Thank you, Donald. Thank you, Sharif. Ciao.